evaluating, which would typically, you know, be around a project. So I think, yeah, the idea of implementing FESR would be, you know, like fit in this very well, a lot of our projects. So that middle part is kind of what is that process? But then the rest of it, I feel, is like that stakeholder map or that stakeholder engagement, like who's contributing in, where, you know, where are the outputs out? And it's really looking at, you know, scope of influence a little bit, like, do we have access to all these different pieces? What are the resources we need? Who do we need to engage? Who do we, you know, to put your like your project is almost that P, the middle part, but like to kind of put it into the context of where do you fit in the healthcare system, to be able to understand, yeah, do you have the right resources? Because we talk about this in terms of scoping, so I'm sure it's used for other things too. So that's kind of a little bit how I've kind of described it to people, or certainly when I've tried to do it in the moment. But like I said, the example of FESR, are we a input to the system? We're a user of the system. This is where I like it starts to get a little confusing to me, but
So maybe should we try to build one? Because I have the template and we can try to build one for
sure.
FESR. Okay.
Is this the one where I think outputs, I remember they're supposed to be nouns? Like I have random memories of things, but it's not an output, it's not an action, it's a noun, it's a tangible thing.
That would fit with, yeah,
I might be wrong, but I seem to remember something like that. Like it had to be something that it couldn't be, you know, riding a bike. It had to be the bike.
Does that ring a bell, Leanne, that outputs have to be a noun?
Something like that.
We'll let Leanne.
You should just let Leanne start at the beginning.
oh, give her a second to join
I'm
us.
talking and my mic isn't on.
Oh, okay.
Ruth, I hadn't heard that one before, but it actually does make a sense to me when I think about it. Let's test it out tonight, that output would have to be a noun, because they are things. They are things, although they can be things about people, but they are things. They're not actions. Let's think if they're actions too. But that's very interesting. So my apologies for being late. I had seen us discuss this on the WhatsApp. I received the invite from Lawrence, but then this morning I checked it and no one else was signed up on the Zoom call. So I thought maybe no one else is able to do this. So I emailed Lawrence, but then I didn't hear back. So I'm glad you're all here and I'm happy to do this with you. And I wonder who had just put the SIPOC up on the screen.
Yeah, that was me. So I'd put it up, the example from our coaching day that we had used. We had the idea of, if you wanted to look at that one, we could look at that one. But I also had the idea of us trying to build our own SIPOC off of the FESR implementation.
Yeah, that's a good one. It's interesting that all of you are really interested, because I've just been doing one for flow in terms of length of stay. And so it really is a tool you can use all the time, because we've been talking about partnerships, meaning stakeholders. And so it often comes up in planning exercises and when you're doing anything. Do you want to work with that then?
Yes, let's look at yours. Did you already have a SIPOC drawn up for flow, access and flow?
No, I was just going to run through it with you, but
sure.
For FESR, how many people are using FESR on the call? Oh, everybody. Okay, that's great, because I've been using it longer, maybe, unless you're a radiologist, because we did it at BC Cancer. We started about 4 years ago in preparation for Cerner. So it's not a bad one. It's very, very scoped. So maybe that's a good one to start with, because it's very Beginning, ending is very scoped, a small scope, very, very small scope.
Why don't we try it with that one? And then maybe at the end, you can kind of walk us through what you did for access and flow too. That would be really interesting.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. So,
So I have a blank that I'm going to bring on screen now, and we can, as a group, try to walk through what might go in each column. Yeah?
yeah,
So Fessor, date today is June 6th.
so where did you get this template, Lawrence?
I think Eric Worrell sent it to me.
Interesting.
He sent it to all of the cohort members.
Oh, that's great. Okay.
So
So I'm just gonna
coach us,
change the
Leanne.
lighting in the room because I'm not showing up well on your screen, but just start with what, let's say 4 and maybe 5, 4 processes that would be involved. And they have to be sort of upper level 4 processes.
In the implementation of Fessor and Fraser Health.
Not of the implementation, but of the process of Fessor itself.
Of Fessor itself. Oh, okay.
So are you looking at like patient encounter, physician goes to a workstation, dictates, signs off, kind of that kind of?
Yes, that kind of process.
Okay.
That's actually, Martha, you're right. You use it for implementation because you're going to see which stakeholders do we need for this implementation. The first thing you have to do is come up with the process, which is not as easy as it sounds because we're really good at making long, complicated processes. It's harder to come up with sort of 5 distinct stages in the process.
So my suggestions were, oh, formatting is really having fun, isn't it, Lawrence? So are you wanting us to edit it too, or?
Just probably just throw out ideas verbally, Erica.
So my initial thought, if I was thinking 4 or 5, you see a patient in some kind of encounter. You have to find a computer to kind of dictate, or like to do the dictation.
Can you put them in a column, Lawrence? Is that possible?
I think the formatting on this is a bit challenging.
Yes, I agree.
I think
And Lawrence, you're really good at this stuff.
I
Maybe
think
start a new Excel.
yeah, I think those cells are merged in a big are merged in a big gap for handwriting on it.
Mm. Oh, to have it
You know,
as
you
a
could
paper
take the
form.
slide, we could do Miro, or you could take the slide you just put up and we can actually just refill it. The SIPOC slide.
So maybe while Lawrence is getting caught up there.
Keep your, yeah, keep going on your process steps.
So I was just thinking, because I did this yesterday on call. So I see a patient. I have to find a computer. I do the actual dictation. And then I sign off on it.
And for many of us, it is typing at times, yes. But sign off isn't just sign off, it's actually, it's a review and edit,
Editing, yeah.
Yeah.
right? which sometimes takes more than the dictation, but anyway. So it's not just about, so I'm just looking at your step, find the computer, Eric. It's not just about that, it's about
At JP, you have to find, not just find a computer, you have to
Mm.
find one with a microphone,
Yeah. And I like
Yeah.
that the logging on is
and
Yeah.
that takes time.
good.
Lawrence, you're doing splendidly. So I would put edit and sign off in the same because they're kind of one process step.
And the other thing I've learned about in the edit phase is to double check who the carbon copies are going to. Because they don't always go where you think they're going to go, especially now with all the issues with no primary care providers. Because I had someone and they told me they still had a GP, but in the computer they didn't. So I did the whole Fessor thing and it went nowhere because I didn't look. But so I don't know if that's in the edit piece there.
Okay, so this actually looks really good. Okay, so you can go back and forth between these, and you're building something sort of just like when we build a diagram. So you don't have to think that you're completing each column at one time. You sort of will keep populating all over the place as you go, but it all centers around those components of your process. The components of your process just help you to think through the SIPOC so you don't miss anyone. So which column would you like to work on next? That doesn't mean it'll be complete, but just to sort of populate some things relating to that process.
And before you comment, we were just talking about sort of one of the challenges some of us kind of face is the difference between suppliers and inputs, and the same thing for outputs and customers.
Okay.
Like on each side,
So-
those two sort of sometimes get confused. Would you mind walking us through those first?
Yeah, so an input is something you need for the process, but the supplier is who or what supplies the input, or the owner of the input. Does that make sense? You could put in little letters under suppliers, who owns the input, who supplies the input.
So if it's the computer and microphone, then they would be the input and the supplier would be the unit, or, well, Fraser Health, but you have to break it down because it's not Fraser Health, it's that person, is that right?
Yeah. So I'm going to suggest we go with inputs because I know this is difficult, but let's go with inputs. And when you think about this process, you're dictating, you're doing it specifically in M modal. What do you need?
Does this mean history from a patient, like the patient history,
You need
investigations from Meditech?
I always need to update my password.
So you need a password. So that's in there, password. You need a password update. And I've been away trying, like at home or at my cabin trying to dictate, and my password won't update. So I need IT. I have to actually call IT. And it's not just IT, it's transcription that does that for you. So unless you've ever had a password problem, you won't know that, but I've had this problem multiple times. It seems to happen only to me, and I don't know why. They don't know why either.
Speaking to that, you need remote access if you're not on site.
That's true. You need, yep, thanks, Martha. So that's an input, remote access. Maybe make the font smaller, Lawrence, because I think we're gonna have a lot of things in this box. Very lot of things.
I heard something from Diala earlier, but I didn't catch it. Diala, you said something about history or something?
I wasn't sure if it was accurate, but I thought like the page, what goes into the dictation is like the patient history, which is information you're getting from the patient, and information you're getting from Meditech, like the investigations that might have already been done.
I would say history from patient, because that's quite different from historical data. I had a case today that took me 2 hours, and the reason was they didn't really know their history and they were intelligent and so forth, but I had to go to 6 different computer systems to eke out the history since 2015 until I really had it. And it was actually all important and necessary for me to make a decision as to what to do next. Now, I know that's kind of typical for cardiac histories, oncology histories, not maybe everything, but I'm sure even gynecological histories for some patients, Erica, are pretty complicated, and you need to have the actual data. The patient may not understand what really happened during all those losses or something like that. I don't know. So it's not just Meditech data. So I would actually say history from other sources. And then there's investigations, maybe.
I'm gonna add the actual microphone and the computer themselves.
Microphone and computer.
Well, because they say you can do it from your phone, but I've heard split views on whether that works, but I don't want to be doing it in the hallway on my phone.
Yeah, you can do it from the phone.
Well,
you can use your phone as a microphone.
But I don't want to do it in the hallway on my phone.
Right, so how about privacy? Because that's
Yes.
actually a huge issue everywhere. So Ruth, you're so right. Because you can't be dictating this out in a hallway. Even if, now I do use my phone all the time because of lack of microphone, but to be able to use your phone, you have to have remote access.
Yeah.
So that's the thing, like you can use a phone, but you have to have remote access.
I found out that although the microphone doesn't understand the words coming out of my mouth, if someone opens the door and says, "Hey, are you busy?" it picks that up like that and puts, "Hey, are you busy?" right into my dictation.
I've had whole phone conversations on my dictation because I didn't realize it was recording, like it was recording what was in the room, and I was having a long phone conversation with a patient or something. So you need training on this, right? So that's an input, because you can't actually use this system until you have training and skills.
Oh, and whoever mentioned templates, that's the other thing. If you're going to use templates, you need training on how to make templates if that's applicable to you. And but then the other issue is you've just created a cookie cutter documentation, right? Depending on what it is.
I would argue training and comfort, because if you aren't comfortable and it takes, in a merge, if I'm going to see 20 to 30 people, I can't get through my shift if it's taking me an hour each. So that was one thing for me. I had to use it enough beforehand so that I could actually use it efficiently.
Now, again, just like we often go back and forth between driver diagram and process map, I will usually take groups back and forth, back and forth, back and forth to make sure that you've got everything on the process map because you thought of it on the driver diagram, and vice versa. with this one, always go back to your process. So we've got a whole bunch of inputs, but let's just go through each and say we've got every input we need. Have you got every input you need for the patient encounter?
Would you actually put like the patient? Because we talked about history from the patient. Is the patient themselves, or is that implied in the history from the patient?
Are they the supplier?
They're a supplier.
They're the
Thank
supplier
you,
of the
Lawrence.
history. Okay.
Yes.
Mm.
So you see, I know this is tricky because everyone thinks of the patient always as being the thing moving through the system. And often, very, very often they are. But what we're talking about here is an M modal output. It's a Fessor output. And so the patient isn't the thing going through, even though this is patient centric, it's all about patient care. It's that final dictation that is the output.
Is there anything that stops you from having something in the supplier column and in the customer column? Like, can there be duplications or not really?
Well, there sort of is, because history from patient is patient, but the input you see is more specific. What from the patient? So the who is the supplier, but the what is the input. What are they supplying?
Leanne, would this be typical to build from the middle out to like?
You always build from the middle because you have to know what your steps are.
Okay.
But sometimes you will scope the steps because you'll say that's too broad, or you say, wait, we have to include another step here because it brings in all kinds of other stakeholders. So who are the other suppliers? Well, there's like multiple EMRs because you're getting data from them.
IT for the passwords, computers.
Yeah. But then there's, you know, I don't know what I'd call it, but like the unit manager, because they have to make sure that you have your computers, your equipment. IT isn't actually responsible for that.
And it's a different group that does the training too. It's not like the service desk people, right?
Yeah, so you need your trainers.
People.
You need your trainers. And the other thing we found really important is you need your peer trainers. Fessor trainers are different from peer trainers. Have you guys worked with peer trainers?
Does going into someone else's room and complaining and they tell you what to do?
Okay. Yeah, so that does count, Ruth. For sure.
Sure, then yeah, I've had peer trainers and I've been one. Sure.
That's how we get through life as doctors, is talking to somebody else who's in the same boat and we can console each other. But I'll tell you, the peer trainers is vital. So in oncology, I've gotten more from my peer trainers than the Fessor trainers, although the Fessor trainers, like the initial was important. But we have shared hundreds, I would say hundreds of tricks between peer trainers. So you talked about the commands, like in oncology, we've got 450 different chemo protocols. I've got a command for each one that I use. And I just say, this is my command for how I describe carboplatin Taxol for endometrial cancer. And I just go insert command, that one, and it populates my M modal. So this is where my whole, in oncology, our whole thing is populated almost completely by commands. So all we have to work on is the part of the history, like from the patient. And so although we've lost time, because this is definitely a time-consuming process, especially the edit, I find, we gain so much on these functionalities. And for us, the fact that we can keep copying the previous dictation, right? So all the things like, I have a section of diagnosis for cancer patient, that could be everything that's happened to them succinctly said in a little paragraph. I copy and paste that. I'm never redictating it. So all those functions, and the peer review means someone at your elbow who's also a doctor, who does what you do, who shows you sort of a great new ways to do this, what we're all learning together. So I was actually going to say under supplier, there are consultant reports, but I'm saying the referring team or doctor. because I don't know about the rest of you, but if they don't do a very good job of that, they kind of say C for cancer. That's the referral. That's the whole referral. C for cancer. Please C for cancer. That's it. I have to figure out. I usually find 12 other pieces of the medical history that the patient doesn't remember. And these aren't old cognitively, and like these are intact young people. They just don't remember their medical history or things that are important. I have to go sleuthing it all over the place because no one sends me a referral note that says anything about the patient's history. So they're an important stakeholder because they can make or break how difficult or easy this is.
Are you sure you don't work in the pain clinic? Because that's what we get. Pain, assess and treat. Thanks.
I know you do. I know that. So you fix that with your referral form, right? Like you said, you have to send us this information or we can't function. It'll take us 3 hours just to get the history, let alone make an action plan or do a physical. So we may come up with more things under those suppliers. So I wouldn't actually put dictators taking time. That's part of the process. So the length of time it takes you is part of the process. The supplier is what provides the inputs. But you're right, time's an important part of this. And for example, if you're looking at a process, one of the things you might do is do a time motion study and get feedback on how long is it taking for, let's say, a certain group. So let's say Martha emergency or whatever. How long does it take doctors on average, let's say day shifts versus night shifts to complete these dictations from the time they start it until the time they sign off?
So then would that time go in our process instead?
No, it's just a measure of the process, Ruth.
Okay.
It's like a, it's an outcome measure.
Okay.
But it's an important thing because there's no doubt that in the process, time is a factor. How long it takes, does it take time away from other things? But that time is not usually a component in a SIPOC, because what you're looking for here is the stakeholders. But it's interesting, let's come back to that at the end when we look at this particular SIPOC and say, where does that fit in? Because you do need time to do this. So every time you get distracted by something else, it takes away from your being able to complete this process. So let's think on that one, because I haven't heard of time being put in here. And yet your whole team is impacting this. So I experience that every day. Put your hand up if you do.
Yeah.
Because the team doesn't really think of the time the doctor has to spend doing this. It's sort of, that's not visible to them at all. They know you see patients, you write orders, you take history, but that whole dictation piece isn't visible to them as a major time commitment you have to have between the other acts of seeing patients and so forth.
So that piece, so like at JPOCs, they're always doing about room usage and about usage, right? That piece is never collected. So like we might have that our clinic is done at say 3:30, but we're still sitting there until 6:30 at night doing all the dictation. Nowhere is that time captured that a room is being used, all of that's being used, because it's invisible time to everybody.
Yeah, it's invisible time to everyone else, managers, directors, the rest of the team. So this is again with peers where we've found we have to do a lot of normalization of this and really teaching the rest of the team how much time this takes. This is part of a doctor's work. And we have to realize they need some space and time to do that. So let's kind of hang on to that because that's really, really important. But I'll tell you one project we did measure this in was in Guanming Han's project of so this isn't exactly what Carolyn did, but it was the turnaround time for gross. So these are gross specimens. And one of the things they wanted to capture was from the time, you know, did the doctor have time to do their dictation, because that's all part of that whole process from the time the gross starts. And they were looking at having the text do more of the gross and taking that work away from the pathologist, so the pathologist had more time to do the dictation. But one of the things we wanted to look at was how long did the pathologist spend in their day, because they were saying they needed help, they needed more text, etc. And yet, how were we going to measure that? So we actually measured the time of the last dictation. That was the measure we used, and we were able to get it off the M-modal system. So let's say for ER, the pain clinic, if anyone wanted to know how long you actually work, they could just look at your last sign off of the day from the M-modal system, and they would know that that's how long you were working. I don't know if anyone's looking at that right now for doctors, but that's a great example. So you can take this process column and you can do all kinds of measures off of it. So lawyers, I love that. The lawyers are a customer. So let's look at the outputs column, because often this is the column that has the least in it, because everybody's just like, well, the process was designed to create X, so it's X. X is in the output column, right? And it certainly is. But for one example, you were talking about carbon copies. So the output is multiple copies to important people on the patient's team. I don't know how else you would say that.
Maybe patient care team.
Yeah, and I would use the word extended, Jean. Extended care team, because this comes back to the copies. Who's seeing this, right? And this goes back to the other versions we used to have, where we would dictate and transcription would do it. And we would just dictate who we want this sent to, right? But there are actually all these little nuances to this system, which you may or may not have encountered before, about who can view this and how far the copies go. So part of it is you putting in who the copies will go to. Part of it is the fact that in the health system now, this is just starting now, you can now view these no matter where you are in Care Connect. You don't have to be on Meditech, you can be in a private office, but the problem is, Lawrence, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of GPs don't have access to Care Connect.
Yeah, that's correct. Only about 10% of family doctors have signed on and regularly use Care Connect.
So I would actually say in outputs, viewable only on Care Connect. I would put this not under customers, but under outputs, viewable only on Care Connect.
So as somebody who was denied Care Connect, like our pain clinic was, that would be in an input for me, is what do I need? I would like access to Care Connect rather than UCI, because UCI sucks. And Jean has her hand up.
Oh, sorry, Jean, I didn't see your hand.
No, that's okay. I just had a question. So I really like the little sentences under like suppliers and inputs, because that's sort of helping me think of it in a healthcare context. And I'm just wondering, like, just to try and make sure I have the concept in mind for what's an output and what's a customer. If we were doing, for example, hip surgery on this as our process, the output would be like that the hip is repaired, right? The operative success. And, you know, the customer would then be like the physiotherapist, the patient, you know,
Correct.
all of that
Care
track.
team.
Is that the right
Yeah.
train of thought?
But it wouldn't just be, the output wouldn't just be patient with repaired hip. It would be, there would be patient with repaired hip. There would also be dictation. because that goes with the operation. There might also be regional nerve block if that was done during the surgery. So often there's more than just what you think there is in terms of that output. So that's a great example, sort of a surgery. What do you get from that? So what's the output?
So what's your little sentence? Sorry, just follow-up question. Like, would it be like under outputs is list everything you get from this process, or like what's your little trigger question?
That's a good point. I'd have,
For
let me just
healthcare.
think for a second, because this is good. You are forcing me. It's like, this is like a change bundle, Jean. You're saying, okay, Leanne, can you give me an operational definition of how you create that output? So
Concrete
yeah,
thinker over here.
intended is actually an important word, Lawrence. I'm glad you're saying that because it doesn't always happen, but all intended, I would say discrete products. Because obviously, you know, if you do hip surgery, ultimately what you're getting is pain control, like a whole list of things for the patients. But in this, you're really going for sort of discrete products. So if you have a patient with completed surgery, that's a discrete output and all kinds of things are happening in that patient. But then your surgical OR report, so that's the one that, so when Erica does the surgery, she's not just doing surgery. The other product of that surgery is the dictated report. So if we had surgery as a process, the dictated report would be part of that. And maybe, Erica, your post-op orders would be part of that too, am I assuming?
I think, yeah, I'm trying to think, although I was also, I think, yeah, order set. And then I was also thinking about billing, whether billing
Yes.
would be an output as
So
well.
just,
Mhm.
is there another, so I'm giving you examples just so we can all together come up with a really good operational definition of outputs. So it's products as a result of the process or coming from the process. And again, Ruth, I think these are nouns. And if you had something that was a verb, you'd want to sort of put it into a noun, change it into a noun.
Even if it was like a successful hip surgery, that's still a noun because it's done, right? Like
It's a noun.
success. But the other thing about output, so just when I was thinking about when Jean said about, you know, like a hip replacement, I thought, oh, the person goes back to work, the employer's happy, right? You know, like how far do you take this?
So the way I think of outputs, just to help us think, outputs are always, it could be material or someone or something that comes out as a result of the process. So it's anything that comes out of a process. And the way you think of it is all the inputs feed into the process and then something comes out of it, just like a referral or an X-ray report or diagnostic report, all those would be outputs. Another way to look at a SIPOC is just like we've done here, this helps you identify stakeholders.
Yeah.
That's another way you can use a SIPOC. It tells you if we're going to implement change with FESR, these are the type of people who are suppliers. It helps you identify that customer. That way you can even go out and get the voice of the customer in order to feed into the change. So the way I think of it, suppliers are always the internal or external providers that bring in resources. The inputs are the resources that you need in order for the process to take place. And outputs is always whatever comes out of it, out of whatever process you've described. Because if we were to go out and process map after doing this, it'd be easy. We know the scope just by looking at the SIPOC. Where do we start? Where do we end? Who are the people we need to connect with before we implement any changes? This could also help you value stream map in terms of how much time each step is taking to identify where your bottlenecks or delays are happening within the SIPOC. Sorry, just had to chime in.
So Todd, I heard you say that the outputs are you said materials, resources, or people that.
Or service. It
Or
could
service.
be anything, yes.
That result from directly from your process?
Yes. So it's your input plus the process that gives you output. The suppliers bring whatever resource or material. Your input is what you help feed into whatever process that gives you your output. So think of it, if we were going to buy bread, our suppliers would be everyone, the flour guy, the egg guy, the butter guy, the milk guy. I'm trying to simplify it. So the suppliers would be the guy who delivers the flour, the guy who brings the eggs, the guy who brings the milk. So our input would be what? The milk itself, the eggs now, because now the suppliers have delivered the materials we need for input. So our inputs would be flour, eggs, butter, and whatever else. So the process now is mixing all those ingredients, and then our output would be the bread. Does that help? So we still rely on our suppliers. If I'm going to change anything with the way we're baking bread, I may need to connect with my suppliers. Maybe I need to tell them to change the delivery time in order for me to meet my customers' needs. So my customer would be anyone who comes into the bakery to buy the bread. So any change they could impact them. So always think process, the way to help you think what an output is, as the word implies, it's something that comes out of a process. It's always something that gives in birth due to what activity we did.
I think, Todd, that when you said one of the key reasons for this is to identify stakeholders, that's the main reason I use this, is to identify stakeholders, because otherwise they can be hidden. This sort of brings them out because you're really deliberately understanding what comes into and out of the process. So Ruth, if something was funded by workman's comp, maybe then the employer would be a customer. But you always sort of have this end point, and so it's difficult to define. The team sort of has to make a decision how far and broadly that goes. But I think the output here, viewable and Care Connect, that is a really important, and you could, viewable is an adjective, so you could change it to
Available.
EMR, something like EMR, what's the word I'm thinking of?
Like EMR report or
Permanent record on EMR.
Okay.
And then goes equals Care Connect. Or you could go equals UCI. But here's the reason this is important, is all kinds of reports. So I'm ordering echoes all the time on patients who get these specific drugs that can cause cardiotoxicity. And what happens is that when the report is dictated by cardiology, all they say is, please see on the echo image on Care Connect. So what this means is, even if I copy the family doctor, they never ever get a copy, because the report simply says the actual echo report. If you called in and asked, could I please have the echo report, you will receive this report that says, please see, Meditech, or, please see image for report. And that means, as Lawrence said, 90% of the family doctors will never get their echo reports, because it's actually, they've made a unilateral decision that they will tag it at the end of the image that's in Meditech. So only if you're in Meditech or Care Connect. And if you're in Care Connect, you have to be able to see the image. And then you go to the end of the image and there's the report. So there's an example of something dictated in M-modal that means nothing to nobody, because it doesn't actually reach anyone. So that's why these kinds of really thinking about your outputs is very, very important. So I think you've populated this really well. Another thing about SIPOC is we've done this together, right? Because we've got we've got managers here, we've got physicians, we all have different areas we work in. So we've got a sort of little group that's gone through this, but it's very, very important that, for instance, the people planning Fessor don't do this on their own and then say, great. They have to take it to different users and people and say, have we captured everything here? Particularly people who know something about it, have tried it out. We're on the pilot team to try it out, to make sure that everything is captured here. And then what comes of it is you start identifying who do you need to have at the table to make sure that things aren't going wrong, that it's been planned well, that all the training is planned, the peer support's planned, who are all the people that you need. So you need to look at what it looks like for a family doctor who's a customer. What does the end product look like? How does it come to them? Is it by paper? Is it electronically? Are they automatically getting the copy? So I'm meeting right now with some of the medical site directors, and one of them told me that something like 30% of the time the family doctor listed on the acute care chart is wrong. So these reports are going out, but they're going out to the wrong person. So the other person in terms of inputs is actually, it depends on who you give that ownership to, but I would give it to the unit clerk because I think that's a clerical function to make sure with the source, that's the patient, this is your GP. Yes, no, and we're gonna actually fill that in there. So this is how things can go drastically and terribly wrong, and not having the right suppliers listed, etc., because then you don't understand that they're part of the whole rollout of this that will make it work properly.
So Leanne, when you're doing this, so we already know some of the issues with Fessor, like you brought up some, right? And some of it doesn't get where it's supposed to go. There's the way they collect their data. I don't know about the other facilities, but for Surrey and for JP. So like for me in JP, I am compliant. In Surrey, I am rogue. I'm non-compliant and I need to be spoken to, right? Because I have zero Fessor in Surrey because I don't actually do it in that building. I do it in JP. And then they send out data that compares the number of minutes I've spent dictating and the number of minutes I've spent on Fessor. And that's what they track as success or not. But what you just said about it getting to the right person is what I track as success. So do we put all those pieces in this too, or are those things that we're gonna learn later and they like, are you supposed to come up with all of those things when you do this as to the best of your ability?
Well, it will come out of it, won't it? And this is how I think it's so important how the different tools we use as improvers populate each other, as I said. So there are measures that will come out of this. There will be measures you won't think about till you do the SIPOC, honestly. Even if you did a process map, it won't be so apparent to you as if you do the SIPOC. Because the SIPOC is about the people in the system that are going all the way from supplier down to customer. And so what you're talking about, like how would you find out how it's working? Those are your measures. And it could be outcome measures, so the outputs and the customers. It could be process measures. How is the process doing? And that would not be captured on your SIPOC, but it's something your SIPOC might help you to think through. And also to think through, you know where this is really good sometimes? Is pointing out how the wrong measure is being measured. Because if you show it like this to managers and directors and so forth, and you say, so you're measuring this, but here's actually what's happening. The owner who's responsible for that is this person. If you're measuring me with respect to that, I have no control over it. So measuring me is sort of pointless because I can't make it better or worse. Do you understand that concept? It helps you to figure out what the measure should be. And also if they're measuring something, if it's the wrong something.
Well, I know, like when you're saying like the measurement piece, so as a department head, I get a list of everybody and how many minutes they've spent on Fessor, and I'm just like, cool. Like, you know, it could have been one patient, like you said, took 2 hours to do it. It could have been a whole, you know, like it's a arbitrary thing, and I don't know what the outcome is, like what's the gold I'm searching for in that number, where I want accurate reports that don't say, when I say our MOA will send that and it types aloha mora in there, or a pixaban is a pig in a band, you know, like those things.
So Ruth, I go back to the peer review, because in oncology, because we're heading towards sooner, and this was like, it was mandated, it's measured, just like you're saying, we're getting these measurements too. We've started in our peer report, we have the funniest like AI, the funniest like transcription of what you actually said. And that's what we shared. Like this went on for a year, every week, because we were just so frustrated. We would share in our peer group the funniest, most ridiculous thing that it transcribed that made no sense. So obviously it isn't even just about how you say something and dictate. It's not, the system doesn't use logic. Totally agree with you, but also, so think about that. Who made these measures? Who decided what would be reported out to department heads? I have to say, just like we did with Guanming, I think one of the things I want to know is, how late are these people staying to do this? How late are they having to stay to sort of finish all this up? So I would want to know, like the time they closed off on their FESR, on their M modal for the day. And that's tricky too, right? Because some people have half-day clinics, so you wouldn't expect them to finish at 5. You'd expect them to maybe finish at 2. But it does help you to think through what are the really good measures. What should you be measuring about this process, and who should you be measuring it on?
Leanne, can I ask a question? I'm gonna have to slip out soon. This was wonderful. My question is, as we are teaching this, should we first be saying, ideally people should be making a detailed process map, pick out the key 5 points from that, and then at what point, I think it's important pretty early on to know who your stakeholders are. So do you agree that this process should be done early in the project, or at what point do you encourage the use of SIPOC?
You could use it at many different points in time is the answer, Martha. And I think that it's dangerous, I'm going to use that word, to do QI without having done any kind of process map. I just think if you talk about what are the key things you need to do, you need to form a team, you need to really communicate and talk to people. Yes, you need to have an aim, so what are you doing, what are you focusing on? But I think that I actually, because I've taught this in BC Cancer, I've taught teams when they're trying to do a strategic aim, and we're sort of going through all the parts of fundamentals. Actually, I do process map first. I do process map before driver diagram. I do aim first, so then that's on your driver diagram, but then we go do process map, and then we come back and we populate the driver diagram with what we're seeing from the process map, because we're understanding, okay, what's driving this process, which is different, right? That's different from SIPOC. That's getting to your drivers and sub-drivers. And then sometimes we take the stakeholders off the driver diagram and off the process. So those two side by side. Now pull out your stakeholders. And sometimes that's all you need to do with a team. That's enough. Because remember, in cohort, they're learning, right? You don't want to make this too complicated. I think SIPOC is actually an advanced skill. But you can come back later, like a little bit midway through. You can come back and say, especially if they found stumbling blocks or constraints or things like that, you can use this in your coaching repertoire and say, why don't we do something called SIPOC? And I'll show you what that's about. You've already populated a lot about it, but it might help us see the stakeholders we're not communicating with, who we really need to communicate with. The other place SIPOC has to happen is before implementation. Okay, when you're going to implement, then you might have been working on a process that's very contained and the team has it and whatever. As soon as you go and implement, all those people who weren't involved are going to sometimes cry bloody murder, because they'll say, you didn't ask us, you sort of implementing this, you've got all this referral form and all these things for me to fill out, and I'm a family doctor and I'm just not going to fill all that out for you. So you have to go really carefully with your SIPOC when you're going to implement, because it's going to affect a lot of people. And that's where with standards, you want to send out your standards 3 times to your stakeholders. First time when you're kind of drafting it and you get their input, and then you try to adapt to what they've told you. Like if you don't try to adapt, you'll give them something they will never do, right? If you have stakeholders that are holding out on something. Revise it, send it back to the stakeholders, get their feedback back, try to adjust everything so it fits with all their concerns and whatever. Third time is it. Like that's when you've got your consensus that this, whatever it is, protocol, PPO, checklist, whatever it is you're doing, algorithm of a procedure. So that happens a lot in sort of technical areas. So I have used this the most, I would say, pre-implementation. You've taken something a smaller team's done, and now you're going to try and implement it so the stakeholders start to get varied and all over the place, because they're going to be somewhere on that diagram, a supplier or a customer or something like that.
That's really helpful. Thanks.
It's tricky, and it's one of those things like driver diagrams. We all think that's pretty easy at this point, but do you remember how hard the driver diagram was when you first did it? And you were putting change ideas where drivers should be and all this kind of thing because you weren't used to using it. But once you get used to this, it's a really, really helpful tool in quality.
Okay, thank you so much, Leanne. It's been taken over an hour of your time. Any other last questions? Otherwise, we'll call it for the night.
I just
Maybe
want to say,
sometime we should try another one, like same group, less time, because we kind of figure, and just do somebody else's something one of you is working on, and let's as a group just go through it again, because it's like what is it? See one, do one, teach one. So here's one that we saw, right? And then we can do another one, and then you're ready to teach it.
I just want to say thanks for this, because like I get a little bit of SIPOC, but I'm not comfortable enough to feel that I could support someone else to do it. So the more chance I get to do this, the more comfortable I would feel to help somebody else. So thanks, Leanne.
Yeah, really pleased to do it, and just pleased to have all of you here and interested, because I really think as we use these tools in the health authority will come to see us as indispensable, because they're not necessarily always looking this deeply at sort of the people part and the impact. And it's really important to do this. But yeah, let's meet again. I think we meet again and pick another problem. One of us can email, it won't be me, because I said I'm really working hard on the access and flow one. It's just like, you can't believe the stakeholders. They just keep coming. And how do you meet all the interests of all these stakeholders?